They called it the Iron Winter. The year was 936 CE, and across Scandinavia, temperatures dropped so low that the sea itself began to freeze. In the great halls of Norse chieftains, families huddled together as the cold crept through stone walls like a living thing, searching for victims. But in one longhouse in what is now Denmark, something impossible was happening. While neighboring settlements froze to death, this community stayed warm without burning a single extra log. The secret lay buried beneath their feet for over 1,000 years. When archaeologists first entered the ruins of Fyrkat in 1950, they expected to find the usual Viking remains: weapons, jewelry, perhaps some pottery. Instead, they discovered something that changed everything historians thought they knew about medieval life. Beneath the floorboards of the ancient longhouse, a network of stone channels snaked through the earth like the roots of some massive tree. These weren't sewers or storage spaces. They were part of a heating system so advanced that modern engineers still struggle to understand how it worked. The Vikings had solved one of humanity's oldest problems: how to survive when nature itself wants you dead. But this wasn't just about staying alive. In the harsh world of medieval Scandinavia, warmth meant power. It meant the difference between a thriving community and frozen corpses discovered by spring traders. The Norse understood this with deadly clarity, and they built their entire civilization around mastering fire. Picture a world where winter lasts 8 months, where the sun disappears for weeks at a time, leaving only endless darkness and cold that can kill a grown man in minutes. This was the reality that shaped the Viking spirit. They didn't just raid and pillage because they were warriors by nature. They did it because their homeland demanded it. Every piece of wood, every animal hide, every drop of whale oil was precious beyond measure. The chronicles tell us that Viking raids began increasing dramatically during periods of harsh winters. When the cold grew too bitter, when fuel ran low, when children began dying in the night, the longships would launch. Not for glory or gold, but for the simple materials needed to keep their fires burning. The monk Alcuin of York, writing about a Viking raid in 793, captured this desperation. They came like wolves in winter, taking not just treasure, but every scrap of wood and cloth they could carry. But raiding was dangerous and unpredictable. The smartest Viking leaders understood that true survival meant creating systems that could last through any winter, no matter how brutal. They became master engineers of warmth, developing techniques that modern survivalists are only now rediscovering. The first breakthrough came from understanding fire itself. Most medieval people thought of fire as something you simply made by striking flint and steel. The Vikings learned to think of fire as a living thing that needed to be fed, directed, and controlled. They discovered that different materials burned in different ways. Wood gave quick heat, but died fast. Peat burned low and steady for hours. Animal dung produced surprising warmth and lasted even longer than some woods. But the real genius lay in how they moved that heat around their homes. Deep in the forests of Norway, archaeologists have found evidence of sophisticated wood-cutting operations that supplied not just fuel, but specific types of wood for specific purposes. Oak for the longest-burning base fires. Pine for quick heat when temperatures dropped suddenly. Birch for the sweet-smelling smoke that helped preserve food and keep insects away. The Vikings also discovered something that modern science has only recently confirmed. The human body is an excellent heat source. A sleeping person generates about as much warmth as a 75-watt light bulb. In a properly designed space, the body heat of 20 people could warm an entire hall. But this required precise social organization and architectural planning. The longhouse wasn't just a building, it was a carefully engineered thermal environment. Every person had a designated sleeping spot based on a complex calculation of social rank, body size, and heat production. The largest, warmest bodies slept in positions where their heat would benefit the most people. Children and elderly individuals were placed where they could absorb the maximum warmth from multiple sources. This system created its own social pressures. Being assigned to a cold sleeping position wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be a death sentence. Sagas record bitter disputes over sleeping arrangements, with some conflicts escalating into blood feuds that lasted generations. The phrase cold shoulder may actually originate from these medieval heating hierarchies, where being pushed to the outer, colder areas of the hall represented social rejection. As winter deepened and fuel became scarce, these communities faced impossible choices: share the remaining heat equally and risk everyone dying, or protect the core group and sacrifice the weakest. Archaeological evidence suggests that different communities chose different strategies with varying degrees of success. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Mess up the heating system, and your entire clan dies. Get it right, and you could survive anything the North could throw at you. This pressure created some of the most innovative engineering solutions in medieval history. But technology was only half the battle. The other half was politics, resources, and the deadly competition between communities trying to gather enough fuel to survive another winter. That competition would soon turn into warfare, with consequences that would reshape the Viking world forever. The peat bog stretches endlessly across the Irish countryside, dark and silent under gray skies. But buried in this seemingly empty landscape lies evidence of a crime that happened over 1,000 years ago, a crime that reveals the deadly politics behind Viking heating systems. In 1952, workers cutting peat for fuel made a disturbing discovery. Perfectly preserved in the bog was the body of a Viking-age man, his throat cut, his hands bound. But this wasn't just another victim of medieval violence. Analysis revealed something shocking. He had been killed during winter, and his body showed signs of severe malnutrition and frostbite. He had died, not in battle, but in the desperate struggle for survival that defined Viking winters. The Bogman's story reveals a dark truth about Viking heating systems. They didn't fail because of bad engineering. They failed because of human nature. Controlling heat meant controlling life and death. In Viking society, the person who decided how much fuel to burn, who got to sleep closest to the fire, and how food was rationed during the cold months held absolute power. This created opportunities for both heroic leadership and devastating betrayal. Archaeological evidence from settlements across Scandinavia tells the same story over and over. Communities that worked together survived. Communities that turned on each other died. But cooperation wasn't always possible, especially when resources ran desperately low. The Great Hall at Gamla Uppsala in Sweden provides a perfect example of how these systems worked when they functioned properly. This massive structure could house over 200 people during winter months. But housing them wasn't enough. They all had to be kept warm, fed, and organized in ways that prevented conflicts from erupting into violence. The hall's central hearth was enormous, measuring nearly 12 feet across and lined with stones that took hours to heat, but then radiated warmth for days. Surrounding this central fire were smaller heating points, each serving different sections of the community. The archaeological evidence shows careful planning. Sleeping areas for families with young children placed where they would receive maximum heat, work areas positioned to take advantage of both warmth and light from the fires. But the most brilliant aspect of the system was how it handled fuel management. Instead of storing all fuel in one location where it could be hoarded or stolen, the Vikings distributed smaller fuel caches throughout the settlement. Each family group was responsible for maintaining their own supply, but surplus was shared according to strict social rules that prevented anyone from gaining too much power over the heating system. This distribution system reveals sophisticated understanding of both engineering and human psychology. No single person could control all the heat, which prevented the kind of despotism that destroyed other communities. But the system also required constant cooperation and mutual trust. Trust that wouldn't always survive the pressure of a brutal winter. The Landnámabók, one of our most detailed sources about early Viking society, records what happened when these systems broke down. During the terrible winter of 975 CE, several Icelandic settlements faced severe fuel shortages. Instead of sharing resources, competing families began hoarding wood and peat. Some went further, conducting night raids on their neighbors' fuel stores. The raids escalated quickly. What began as desperate attempts to steal firewood became systematic destruction of heating systems. Families would sneak into rival longhouses and damage the carefully constructed air channels that distributed heat. They would contaminate fuel supplies with dirt and stones. Some even went so far as to deliberately break the clay pipes that carried warm air to sleeping areas. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated attempts to weaken competing families by making their heating systems less efficient. In a world where a 10-degree difference in temperature could mean survival or death, such sabotage was essentially murder. The archaeological record preserves evidence of these heating wars across multiple sites. At Stong in Iceland, excavators found a longhouse where someone had deliberately filled the central hearth with sand and stones, making it impossible to use. The human remains found in this building tell a grim story. An entire family that froze to death not because of natural disaster, but because of human cruelty. But even more disturbing than the sabotage was what happened next. Communities that survived these fuel wars became increasingly paranoid and defensive. They began building their heating systems like fortresses, with hidden fuel stores and secret passages that allowed them to tend fires without being seen by potential raiders. The social trust that made complex heating systems possible began to break down. Families started sleeping with weapons beside their beds, not just to defend against foreign raiders, but to protect their heat sources from neighbors. This paranoia had devastating long-term consequences. As communities became more isolated and defensive, they lost the cooperation that made their heating systems so effective. Families that had once shared labor to cut and transport fuel began working alone. The sophisticated distribution networks that spread heat efficiently throughout settlements were abandoned in favor of simpler, less effective systems that each family could control independently. The result was predictable. Heating systems became less efficient just as the climate was becoming harsher. The medieval warm period was ending, and temperatures across Scandinavia were beginning to drop toward what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Communities that had survived for generations began to fail. Archaeological evidence shows a pattern of abandonment across much of the Norse world during the late 10th and early 11th centuries. These weren't settlements destroyed by warfare or natural disasters. They were communities that simply couldn't generate enough heat to survive increasingly brutal winters. But some communities found different solutions. Instead of fighting over traditional fuel sources, they began experimenting with new materials and techniques. They discovered that certain types of animal dung burned hotter and longer than wood. They learned to use whale blubber as a long-lasting fuel source. Most importantly, they developed new social structures that could maintain cooperation even under extreme pressure. These innovations would prove crucial as Viking society faced its greatest challenge yet: the arrival of a new religion that challenged everything they knew about fire, community, and survival itself. The Christian missionary arrived at the Norwegian settlement on the coldest day of winter, his breath forming ice crystals in the air as he spoke. His message was simple: abandon your pagan fire worship, embrace the true God, and salvation would keep you warm. 3 months later, half the community was dead. This wasn't the first time religious conversion had turned deadly in the Viking world, but it would be one of the most documented disasters in medieval history. Brother Ansgar, the Frankish monk who brought Christianity to Scandinavia in the 9th century, never understood what he was really asking the Norse people to give up. To him, their elaborate fire rituals seemed like simple superstition. Sacred flames burning in temples, offerings of precious materials to ensure the hearth fires never died, complex ceremonies marking the lighting of winter fires. All of this appeared to be pointless paganism that needed to be swept away. But the Vikings weren't just worshipping fire for spiritual reasons. Every one of those pagan practices served a crucial practical purpose in their heating systems. The sacred flames that burned continuously in Norse temples weren't just religious symbols. They were seed fires, carefully maintained sources of flame that could restart heating systems if the main fires went out. In a world without matches or easy ways to create fire, Losing your flame could mean death for an entire community. The temple fires were insurance policies, tended by people whose only job was keeping them alive. When Christian converts abandoned these practices, they lost their backup heating systems. Archaeological evidence from newly Christian settlements shows a disturbing pattern: increased rates of death from cold during the first winters after conversion. The problem went deeper than just losing the temple fires. Traditional Norse heating systems were built around community cooperation that was reinforced by religious practices. The autumn fire lighting ceremonies didn't just mark the beginning of winter. They were social events that organized fuel gathering, established heating hierarchies, and renewed the community bonds that made shared warmth possible. Christian missionaries saw these gatherings as pagan festivals that needed to be stopped. They didn't realize they were dismantling the social structure that made Viking heating systems work. At Hedeby, the great trading center of medieval Denmark, archaeologists have found evidence of what happened when these two systems collided. The settlement had been successfully using sophisticated heating technology for over 2 centuries. Stone-lined channels distributed heat throughout the community. Carefully managed fuel stores provided winter warmth for hundreds of people. Complex social agreements ensured that everyone contributed labor and resources to maintain the system. Then Christianity arrived. The new converts began refusing to participate in fuel-gathering ceremonies they now saw as pagan rituals. They stopped contributing to community fuel stores, choosing instead to rely on individual family heating systems. Most dangerously, they began disrupting the social hierarchies that determined sleeping arrangements and heat distribution. The old system had been far from perfect. It was based on rigid social rankings that gave the wealthy better access to warmth. But it worked. Everyone knew their place, everyone contributed what they could, and the community survived together. The Christian converts wanted to create a more equal system where all believers shared equally in God's warmth. This sounds noble, but ignore the practical realities of medieval heating technology. Equal distribution of heat wasn't just difficult. It was impossible with the fuel resources available. The result was chaos. Traditional leaders lost the authority to organize fuel gathering and heat distribution. Christian leaders had moral authority, but no practical knowledge of heating systems. Communities that had cooperated for generations began splitting into competing groups. But the most devastating change was the abandonment of proven heating technologies in favor of new Christian practices. Many Norse heating rituals were based on centuries of practical experience. The specific woods burned during certain ceremonies weren't chosen for religious reasons. They were chosen because they produced the best heat. The timing of fuel gathering wasn't based on pagan calendar calculations. It was based on when different materials would be driest and burn most efficiently. Christian missionaries, not understanding the practical knowledge embedded in these traditions, encouraged converts to abandon them entirely. New Christian heating practices were based on Mediterranean traditions that simply didn't work in Scandinavian winters. The archaeological record tells the story. At settlement after settlement across the newly Christian parts of Scandinavia, heating systems became less efficient after conversion. Fuel consumption increased while heat output decreased. Communities that had thrived for generations began struggling to survive winters. Some settlements found ways to blend old and new practices. They kept the practical heating knowledge while adapting the religious aspects to Christian beliefs. These communities often survived and even thrived, but others tried to completely abandon traditional methods. The results were often catastrophic. The Greenland settlements provide the most dramatic example. When Eric the Red established Norse colonies in Greenland around 985 CE, they used traditional heating systems that had been perfected over centuries. These communities survived for over 400 years in one of the harshest climates on Earth. But as Christianity spread through the Greenland settlements, traditional heating practices began to change. Archaeological evidence from the later periods shows Christian communities abandoning proven techniques in favor of less effective methods they believed were more in line with their faith. The last written record from Norse Greenland is a wedding certificate from 1408 CE. After that, silence. When European explorers returned to Greenland centuries later, they found only ruins and bones. Climate change played a role in the collapse of Norse Greenland. The medieval warm period was ending and temperatures were dropping. But archaeological evidence suggests that changes in heating technology made the communities more vulnerable to climate shifts they might have otherwise survived. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of life. It was the loss of knowledge. Centuries of practical experience in cold weather survival disappeared along with the communities that held it. But in other parts of the Viking world, something different was happening. Some communities were finding ways to adapt their heating systems to new challenges, discovering fuel sources and techniques that would prove even more effective than traditional methods. These innovations would determine which Norse communities survived into the modern age. The whale beached itself on the shores of Iceland in the winter of 1089 CE, and for the starving settlement of Reykjanes, it might as well have been a gift from the gods. But this wasn't just food for a desperate community. It was the key to a heating revolution that would transform Viking survival technology forever. When the villagers began processing the massive carcass, they discovered something that changed everything they thought they knew about fuel. The whale's blubber didn't just burn. It burned hotter and longer than any material they had ever encountered. 1 pound of whale blubber contained as much heat energy as 20 pounds of wood. In a land where every tree was precious and winters could last 8 months, this discovery was more valuable than gold. But harvesting this incredible fuel source came with deadly risks that would push Viking engineering to its absolute limits. The island Dingisögur, the great sagas of Iceland, record over 30 instances of communities fighting brutal wars over beached whales. These weren't simple disputes over food. They were battles for the fuel resources that meant survival or death. The problem was that whale blubber required completely different handling than traditional fuels. Wood and peat could be stored safely for months. Whale blubber would rot if not processed correctly, producing toxic fumes that could kill an entire family. The Vikings had to develop entirely new technologies to harness this powerful fuel source. At Skálholt in Iceland, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of sophisticated blubber processing facilities that reveal the incredible ingenuity of medieval Norse engineers. Stone-lined pits allowed communities to render whale fat into oil that could be stored safely through the winter. Clay vessels, fired at precisely the right temperatures, held the oil without cracking or leaking. But the real breakthrough was learning how to burn whale oil efficiently. Traditional Viking hearths were designed for wood and peat, which burn with steady, predictable flames. Whale oil burned explosively, producing intense heat but also dangerous flare-ups that could set entire buildings on fire. The solution required redesigning the fundamental architecture of Viking heating systems. Archaeological evidence from late-period Norse settlements shows dramatic changes in hearth construction. Instead of simple stone fire pits, communities began building complex multi-chamber systems that could control the flow of air and fuel with precision. Stone baffles directed flames in specific patterns. Clay pipes carried excess heat to storage areas where it could be released slowly over time. These weren't just improved heating systems. They were early versions of controlled combustion technology that wouldn't be reinvented until the industrial age. But mastering whale oil was only part of the story. As traditional fuel sources became scarcer due to climate change and overharvesting, Viking communities were forced to experiment with increasingly exotic materials. In the Faroe Islands, archaeological digs have revealed evidence of systematic bird harvesting operations that supplied not just food, but fuel. The rendered fat from thousands of seabirds was processed into a high-energy fuel that burned cleanly and produced minimal smoke. The operation required precise timing. The birds had to be caught during specific seasons when their fat content was highest. Even more remarkably, some communities learned to use human waste as a fuel source. This wasn't just desperation, it was sophisticated understanding of combustion chemistry. Dried human waste, when mixed with other organic materials and processed correctly, could burn hot enough to heat large spaces. The The social implications of these new fuel sources were enormous. Traditional heating systems had been based on community cooperation in gathering wood and peat. The new fuels required different kinds of cooperation, specialized knowledge, dangerous processing techniques, and careful timing that only experts could manage. This created a new class of heating specialists, people whose job was understanding the complex chemistry of exotic fuels. These specialists held incredible power in Viking communities because they controlled access to the heat that kept everyone alive. But specialization also created new vulnerabilities. Communities that relied on expert knowledge were helpless if those experts died or left. Several settlements in remote areas of Iceland simply disappeared when their heating specialists were killed in accidents or conflicts. The most successful communities found ways to spread this knowledge while still maintaining the cooperation that made complex heating systems possible. They developed apprenticeship systems that ensured heating knowledge could be passed down through generations. They created redundant storage systems that prevented any single disaster from destroying their fuel supplies. Most importantly, they maintained the social structures that could organize large-scale fuel gathering and processing operations. Rendering whale blubber or processing bird fat required dozens of people working together with precise timing. Communities that could coordinate these efforts thrived. Communities that couldn't simply died. As the medieval warm period ended and the Little Ice Age began, these innovations became matters of life and death. Communities with access to high-energy fuels like whale oil could maintain warmth even as temperatures dropped to levels that would have killed earlier generations. But the new fuel sources also created new forms of conflict. Whale oil was so valuable that communities would travel hundreds of miles to claim beached whales. Bird harvesting areas became contested territories where different groups fought for access to the fat-rich species that meant survival. These resource wars would ultimately reshape the political landscape of the North Atlantic, as communities that controlled the best fuel sources gained power over their neighbors. The age of traditional Viking raiding was ending, but a new age of resource-based warfare was just beginning. The stakes had never been higher. Master these new heating technologies, and your community could survive anything the changing climate could throw at you. Fail to adapt, and join the growing list of settlements that simply vanished into the cold, dark northern winters. The smoke rising from the chimneys of Bergen looked wrong. It was too thick, too dark, and it carried a smell that made people cover their faces as they walked through the streets. The year was 1349, and something terrible was burning in the great trading city of medieval Norway. It wasn't just wood or peat creating that ominous smoke. It was bodies, thousands of them. The Black Death had arrived in Scandinavia, and with it came the collapse of the heating systems that had kept Norse communities alive for centuries. But from this disaster would emerge the most revolutionary heating technology the Vikings had ever developed, and the key to understanding how their innovation survived into the modern world. When a plague struck Bergen in the winter of 1349, it didn't just kill people. It destroyed the complex social networks that made Viking heating systems possible. The craftsmen who maintained the stone channels died. The fuel gatherers who supplied whale oil never returned from their expeditions. The heating specialists who understood the delicate chemistry of exotic fuels lay dead in their workshops. Within months, heating systems that had functioned for generations simply stopped working. But in the chaos of societal collapse, a few desperate communities made discoveries that would revolutionize cold weather survival forever. At Briggen, the famous wooden buildings that housed Bergen's merchants, archaeologists have found evidence of the most advanced heating system ever developed in medieval Europe. Faced with fuel shortages and the breakdown of traditional supply networks, the surviving merchants created something unprecedented, a district-wide heating system that used waste materials from their trading operations. The genius lay in understanding that everything could burn if you knew how to burn it properly. Sawdust from lumber operations, normally thrown away, was compressed into dense blocks that burned hotter than most woods. Textile scraps from cloth trading were woven into tight bundles that provided steady, long-lasting heat. Even food waste was processed into combustible materials that could supplement traditional fuels. But the real breakthrough came when they learned to burn tar. Bergen was a major center for shipping, and ships required enormous amounts of tar for waterproofing. The production process created huge quantities of waste tar that was normally considered useless. But the desperate merchants discovered that this waste tar burned with incredible intensity, producing more heat per pound than any fuel they had ever encountered. The problem was that burning tar produced toxic fumes that could kill anyone who breathed them. The solution required engineering brilliance that pushed medieval technology to its absolute limits. The Briggen heating system used a network of underground chambers to burn tar in controlled conditions, then channel the heat through stone passages while filtering out the dangerous gases. Fresh air was drawn through separate channels, heated by passing near the tar fires, then distributed throughout the buildings. It was a complete environmental control system that maintained both warmth and air quality. Archaeological evidence shows that this system was so effective that the Briggen merchants could maintain comfortable temperatures even during the worst winters of the Little Ice Age. While communities across Scandinavia were abandoning settlements due to cold, Bergen was actually expanding. But the tar-burning technology came with a terrible cost. The system required constant maintenance by specialists who were gradually being poisoned by exposure to the toxic materials they worked with. Guild records from Bergen show that heating system workers had much shorter lifespans than other craftsmen, dying from lung diseases and other ailments that modern science recognizes as chemical poisoning. The merchants knew their heating specialists were dying, but they also knew that without the system, everyone would die. It was a calculated trade-off between certain death from cold and probable death from poison. This moral dilemma reveals something crucial about Viking heating technology that earlier acts only hinted at. These weren't just engineering solutions. They were social and ethical decisions about who lived, who died, and what prices communities were willing to pay for survival. The success of the Bergen system attracted attention from across the Norse world. Communities facing their own heating crises sent representatives to learn the new techniques. But copying the technology proved almost impossible without also copying the social structures that made it work. The tar-burning system required incredible coordination between dozens of specialists. Fuel had to be prepared according to precise specifications. Fires had to be tended constantly by people who understood the complex chemistry involved. Airflow had to be monitored and adjusted based on wind conditions, temperature changes, and fuel quality. Most importantly, the system required a community wealthy enough to replace heating specialists as they died from occupational hazards. Poor communities simply couldn't afford the human cost of the most advanced heating technology. This created a new form of inequality in the post-plague Norse world. Wealthy trading communities like Bergen could maintain sophisticated heating systems that allowed them to thrive even as the climate grew harsher. Poor agricultural communities were forced to rely on increasingly primitive heating methods as traditional fuel sources became scarcer. The gap between rich and poor communities became literally a matter of degrees, the difference in temperature that separated survival from death. But some poor communities found their own solutions. Unable to afford complex heating systems, they instead perfected the art of human heat conservation. Archaeological evidence from remote Icelandic settlements shows incredibly efficient building designs that maximize the warming effect of human body heat. These communities developed social practices that seemed strange to modern eyes, but made perfect sense in the context of survival. Families would sleep in carefully orchestrated arrangements that optimized heat sharing. Work schedules were organized around the warmest parts of the day. Even clothing was designed as part of an integrated heating system that captured and retained every bit of warmth the human body produced. The contrast between rich and poor heating solutions reveals the full spectrum of Viking innovation. At one end, complex technological systems that burned exotic fuels with scientific precision. At the other end, elegant social solutions that turned human communities into heating systems themselves. Both approaches worked, but they created very different kinds of societies with very different vulnerabilities and strengths. As the Little Ice Age deepened and temperatures continued to drop, these different heating strategies would be tested to their absolute limits. Some communities would survive to pass their knowledge into the modern world. Others would join the long list of Norse settlements that simply vanished into the cold, leaving only archaeological traces of their final desperate winters. The fire has been burning for over 800 years, and it has never gone out. Not once. In the remote village of Glomber, Iceland, an ancient heating system still warms the same families whose Viking ancestors built it in the 12th century. But this isn't just a relic of the past. It's the key to humanity's future. Today, as modern civilization faces energy crises and climate change, engineers are racing to understand secrets that medieval Norse communities took to their graves. The answers they're finding are changing everything we thought we knew about heating, community, and survival itself. Dr. Birgitta Wallace stands in the ancient longhouse, her breath visible in the cold air despite the warmth radiating from stones that have absorbed heat for 8 centuries. She's one of the world's leading experts on Viking technology, and she's about to reveal discoveries that could revolutionize modern heating systems. The thermal imaging camera in her hands shows something remarkable. The turf-covered walls of this medieval building are maintaining internal temperatures that would require massive amounts of energy in a modern home. But the fuel consumption is minimal, just small amounts of sustainably harvested materials that regenerate faster than they're used. The secret lies in principles that modern engineering is only beginning to understand. The Viking heating system at Glomber doesn't just produce heat. It stores it, moves it, and releases it with an efficiency that rivals the most advanced modern technology. The thick turf walls aren't just insulation. They're thermal batteries that absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. The stone foundations aren't just structural supports. They're heat sinks that moderate temperature swings and provide steady warmth for hours after the fires die down. But perhaps most remarkably, the entire system is powered by waste materials that modern society throws away. The turf that covers the roof is cut from local meadows in a sustainable rotation that actually improves the grassland over time. The dried sheep dung that fuels the fires is processed using techniques that eliminate odors while maximizing heat output. Even food scraps are incorporated into the fuel system through composting processes that produce both fertilizer and combustible materials. This isn't primitive technology. It's a closed-loop energy system that produces no waste and requires no external fuel inputs. Dr. Wallace explains the implications. We've been thinking about heating all wrong. We focus on producing more energy when we should be focusing on using energy more efficiently. The Vikings understood something we're just rediscovering, that the best heating system isn't the one that burns the most fuel, it's the one that needs the least fuel while keeping people comfortable. Modern engineers studying Viking heating systems have made discoveries that are already changing contemporary building design. The principle of thermal mass, using heavy materials to store and release heat slowly, is now being incorporated into everything from office buildings to spacecraft. The concept of community heating, where multiple buildings share a single efficient heat source, is being adapted for modern neighborhoods facing energy crises. But the most important lessons aren't technical, they're social. Viking heating systems worked because they were built around community cooperation and shared responsibility. Everyone contributed labor, materials, and expertise to maintain systems that kept the entire community warm. Modern attempts to replicate Viking heating efficiency often fail because they focus on the technology while ignoring the social structures that made it work. In Denmark, experimental communities are trying to recreate Viking-style collective heating systems using modern materials and methods. Early results are promising. These communities are achieving heating efficiencies that exceed conventional systems while building stronger social bonds and reducing individual costs. The project leader, Dr. Erik Lundberg, sees connections between ancient survival strategies and modern challenges. Climate change is forcing us to rethink everything about how we live. The Vikings faced similar pressures, environmental changes that threatened their survival. Their solutions weren't just about technology, they were about creating communities that could adapt and survive together. But replicating Viking heating systems in the modern world faces obstacles that medieval communities never encountered. Modern building codes weren't designed for turf-covered roofs and multi-family heating systems. Insurance companies don't know how to assess risks for heating technologies that have no modern precedents. Most challenging of all, modern society lacks the tight-knit community structures that made Viking heating systems possible. Despite these challenges, Viking heating principles are already influencing modern technology in surprising ways. NASA is studying Viking turf construction techniques for possible use in Mars habitats. Military engineers are adapting Viking fuel preparation methods for cold weather operations. Even urban planners are looking at Viking community heating models as solutions for housing crises in cold climates. The most successful modern applications combine Viking principles with contemporary materials and knowledge. Solar panels can charge batteries that power pumps moving heated air through Viking-style stone channels. Modern insulation materials can make Viking thermal mass systems even more efficient. Computer controls can optimize fuel burning in ways medieval communities could never achieve. But technology alone isn't enough. The communities that successfully adapt Viking heating principles are those that also embrace Viking social values. Cooperation, shared responsibility, and long-term thinking that prioritizes community survival over individual comfort. As Dr. Wallace puts it, the Vikings didn't just figure out how to stay warm. They figured out how to build societies that could survive anything. That's the real lesson we need to learn. In Glombear, the ancient fire continues to burn, tended by descendants of the Vikings who first lit it 8 centuries ago. The techniques they use are the same ones their ancestors developed during the darkest years of the Little Ice Age. But now those techniques are also being studied by scientists who believe they hold keys to humanity's future. The smoke rising from the turf-covered roof carries with it the wisdom of generations who understood that survival isn't just about having enough energy. It's about using energy wisely, sharing resources fairly, and building communities strong enough to face whatever challenges the future might bring. In a world facing energy crises, climate change, and social fragmentation, the Vikings' greatest gift to humanity might not be their ships or their weapons, but their fires and the communities that kept them burning through the longest, coldest nights in human history.